Vesty man said, I'll double your wages, 18 quid a week you'll have in your hand. And Vincent said, we're not talking about wages, we're sitting right here till we get our land. And Vesty man roared, Vesty man thundered, you don't stand the chance of a cinder in snow. And Vince said, if we fall, others are rising from little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
The true origins of Aboriginal history in Australia has been undergoing a major revision and cover-up since around the 1960s, which has intensified into the current times. One area in particular that has been the subject of major fabrication is the land rights movement. Under the guise of reconciliation, progress, and humanitarianism is an undeniable influence of political corruption and the ambitions of radical activists and communists.
We are reading news about the land rights movement allegedly being pursued on behalf of Aborigines. We have even read in the newspapers several times since last November of how people claiming to represent the Aboriginal nation have been to the United Nations Human Rights Commission seeking the support of that outside body to take Australia to the International Court of Justice in order to question our right to the sovereignty of Australia, to in fact declare that the Aborigines are entitled to self-determination, which in the terms of international law means their right to secede. And it also would mean that the Aboriginal people in fact had sovereignty all over Australia. In the United Nations, evidence has been piled up against our country from all sorts of people, including such as Al Grasby, people like Charlie Perkins.
This agenda, which has been well documented, not only seeks to undermine and betray Australians, but the Aboriginals they pretend to represent. One of the biggest frauds of the modern era regarding the land rights movement is what is called the handback of 1985. On the 26th of October 1985, hundreds of people attended the ceremony in which the title for the Ayers Rock National Park was handed over by the then Bob Hawke government after years of pressure and lobbying into the possession of a group of Pitjantjatjara and Mutitjulu Aboriginals. 5 minutes later, these Aboriginals signed an agreement leasing the park back to the Australian Parks and Wildlife Service for 99 years. These two tribes are now amalgamated under the umbrella of being called the Anangu people, which include a few other small tribes as well. At the time this was going on, pre-internet, the vast majority of Australians had virtually no knowledge of the history of Aboriginal people. Because of this fact, the federal government was able to effect the transfer of the title of Ayers Rock National Park, safe in the knowledge that very few people would doubt the claim that the national park was being returned to its so-called traditional owners. With a lot of help from the media, promoting this farce as some sort of forward leap in progress, the transfer met with very minimal resistance and criticism. Even less was known about the people behind the scenes who made this entire process possible. In a very extensive article on the history of Aboriginal liberation and the land rights movement, written by Jordan Humphreys, on behalf of the Marxist Left Review, he gives a lot of citations, references and resources showing how deeply involved communists were in pioneering the land rights issue and spearheading much of the Aboriginal activism in Australia from the 1930s well into the 1990s. In the article, we read the following, quote, "The CPA's contribution has often been obscured or downplayed by those for whom the natural white allies of Indigenous communities are middle-class humanitarians, university-trained intellectuals, and liberal members of the clergy. Recently, some historians have sought to correct this false narrative and draw attention to the contributions of the CPA and its working class supporters." Unquote. Further down the article on the topic of the agenda behind Aboriginal activism, we read the following, quote, "The handing over to the Aborigines of large tracts of watered and fertile countries, with towns, seaports, railway, roads, etc., to become one or more independent Aboriginal states or republics. The handing back to the Aborigines of all central, northern and northwestern Australia to enable the Aborigines to develop their native pursuits. These Aboriginal republics to be independent of Australian or other foreign powers, to have the right to make treaties with foreign powers, including Australia, establish their own army, governments, industries, and in every way be independent of imperialism." Unquote. To help emphasise some of these points made above, let's refer to what Jeff MacDonald has told us in his book Red Over Black. Quote, "In June 1974, the National Committee of the Communist Party met in Sydney and updated its ongoing program of Aboriginal affairs. Tribune spelt out the program clearly. The demands of the Black Moratorium are simple and explicit: land rights now, and full compensation for all land seized since 1770. Black control of black communities. Communists believe, as do many black militants, that these goals will only be achieved through a revolutionary transformation of Australian society." Unquote. In a book written in 1986 by Peter English, titled Storm over Uluru, the Greatest Hoax of All, there is a lot of facts and information that is presented on the topic of the handover of 1985, which shows the handing over of Ayers Rock to the Mutijulu and Pitjantjatjara community was a political act only, not an advance of interests for Aboriginal people. The most galling aspect is the persistent claim that the rock and surrounding national park has been returned to its traditional owners, when this is simply not true at all, as we will explore with some reading from his book. Peter English has set out to put the matter straight. He has debunked the myth of traditional ownership of Uluru and is right on the target when he discloses that the former Aboriginal ownership of the Ayers Rock region has never been clearly established. For starters, the loosely knit Mutijulu community only came into being in 1981. Peter English, in his book, shows how this Mutijulu community is a creation of white Australian communists and has not been accepted by the traditional owners of the rock, by the descendants of those people who actually are. According to his book, on page 47, we read the following, quote, "It is a pity that, although Aboriginal history of the region has been faithfully recorded by some Australian leading anthropologists, as far back as the days of first contact with Indigenous Aborigines in the latter part of the last century, very little of their writing work has ever been published, except in scientific journals, many of which would be regarded as dry and dust, and of little interest to the inquisitive tourist. These all but forgotten papers and reports are sometimes difficult to locate except in the musty archives of metropolitan museums, the anthropology departments of some state universities, or in such volumes as those containing the transactions of the Royal Society. It will therefore come as some surprise to most readers to learn that the history of Uluru, in Aboriginal terms, falls into three separate and distinct eras: pre-invasion, post-invasion occupation, and desertion of the region. There is a fourth and current phase, circa 1985, which is reoccupation. These historical eras can be categorized as follows. First, the permanent occupation of the region by the tribal group first contacted and positively identified by early research scientists as being the original inhabitants of the area at the time the early white explorers arrived on the scene. Second, the temporary occupation of the Uluru lands by the tribal group which moved eastward out of their own territory, forcing the original owners to vacate the area in the face of threats of attack and flee southwards. Third, the period of almost 50 years when the region remained uninhabited, deserted by both the original owners and those who had usurped and temporarily occupied the territory. Fourth, the reoccupation of the region in the 1980s. This reoccupation has been by the Aboriginal equivalent of a consortium, allegedly consisting of a number of unrelated family groups and the remnants of some tribal subsections, and is said to have been created, sponsored and promoted by white advisors to the Central Land Council in Alice Springs for the express purpose of laying claim to gaining control of the Ayers Rock Mount Olga National Park by alleging former traditional ownership for the prime target of the land rights activists in Central Australia. But in true Aboriginal terms, who should the federal government recognise as the former owners of Ayers Rock region? Certainly not the much publicised Mutitjulu community, many members of which could be quite unable to establish valid hereditary links to the area, but whose traditional ties with the land in Central Australia would most likely be anywhere except the distinct environs of Ayers Rock. Certainly not the Pitjantjatjara who invaded their eastern neighbours' tribal territory 68 years ago and whose temporary occupation lasted less than 20 years. By process of elimination, this leaves the Jankuntjatjara as the only possible claimants to the former territory." Unquote. So, why did the Hawke government and the communist activists insist on the land being given to the wrong tribes? Perhaps by doing so, it would allow for the groundwork to be laid for their political ambitions, which had nothing to do with reconciliation or Aboriginal rights. When we look back through the process, we see that there were certain political interests at work in the background. According to Peter English, there was a phantom Aboriginal organisation registered with the Company's Office in Darwin on the 1st of December 1975 as the Uluru Community Incorporated. On November 18, 1981, the name was changed to the Mutitjulu Community Incorporated, which resulted in the media misleading a gullible public into believing that the Mutitjulus, as they became known, were the former traditional owners of Uluru and culminated in title to Australia's most famous national landmark, being granted to a small group of Aborigines whose claim to former ownership of the region has never been established under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976. In addition to this, the Pitjantjatjara Council and the Central Land Council lobbied the then PM Malcolm Fraser and Aboriginal Affairs Minister Fred Chaney to amend the Aboriginal Land Rights Act to allow an Aboriginal land claim. With these two tribes having the assistance of lobby groups, communist activists and cattle station owners, they were able to lay the groundwork for this land grab and cement it into legislation. Although the Central Australian region, and Alice Springs district in particular, is now often associated with various Aboriginal rights struggles and other protest movements, little is known about the presence of left-wing influences prior to the 1970s. The very first park ranger stationed at Uluru Ayers Rock was a man named Bill Harney, who was officially appointed as early as 1957 and was situated there well into the 1960s. Harney was also a high-ranking member of the Industrial Workers of the World, a socialist unionist movement which was a forerunner to the Communist Party of Australia. At this particular time, however, there was not a lot of corporate, political or even Aboriginal interest in the region. But it was from this point that the influence of communism and Aboriginal advocacy started to snowball. Referring back to Storm over Uluru by Peter English, on page 116 we read the following, quote, "To determine the point in time at which Aboriginal interest first became involved in any commercial enterprise established by white entrepreneurs at Uluru, which had been abandoned by the Aborigines for decades, it is necessary to go back to the 1960s and the development of the Peterman Reserve, west of Ayers Rock National Park." Unquote. From this point we saw the creation of the Dockers Rivers Social Club, the establishment of transport lines to and from the area, and a growing population of Aboriginals, of about 400, which took up the permanent residence there. With an increase in tourism arriving to the area, it has also been noted by many academics over the years, the steady growth of communist influence and land rights activism. According to Jason Gibson of the Liverpool University Press, who wrote an extensive article on the history of communism in Central Australia, quote, "Examining the historical records pertaining to socialist political parties or campaigns has been critical to uncovering some of the people and organisations that first introduced the desert to the class struggle. Given the climate of fear and persecution that those in the party faced during the Cold War, evidence of the CPA's activities is not that easy to unearth. The archival records of the CPA were the most obvious starting point, but when looking for evidence, other fellow travellers, non-CPA members sympathetic to the libertarian and humanitarian aspects of communism, details were, of course, also found outside of the official party archive. Other important historical information on this topic can be found in the police reports and the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, archives. ASIO was deeply concerned about the communist influence among Indigenous populations and kept a close watch on the CPA policies and actions in regards to Aborigines. Their extensive report on the topic produced in the 1960s reveals deep-seated institutional paranoia about communist influences in the Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria." Unquote. There are so many documents in government archives and Australian communist literature which go into great detail about the communist involvement of the land rights movement and the Aboriginal grievance industry, all of which have led to the weaponisation and the fabrication of Aboriginal history and culture. If you would like more detailed information on this topic, I highly recommend you check out a short book titled The Evidence by Jeff MacDonald. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and comment your thoughts below. Also consider sharing this video around on social media. With that being said, thanks for watching. Until next time.